Probably Chuck Ames, math.
Mr. Lanahan with physics.
I would have to say Mr. Valella. He was the best.
Mrs. Price was probably my favorite teacher. She was super cool, and I loved English and reading, so I think that's probably it.
Has to be Mr. Adams. I had him for 2 years, 7th and 8th grade, so proportionally I had him for longer than the other teachers, and I mean, he's just overall great.
My favorite teacher growing up was English teacher Mr. DiVincenzo. He was just a cool dude. He was young, energetic, loved his job.
I had two favorite teachers, Ann Kennedy and Mike Travers.
Mrs. Taylor, 5th grade. She was just she was like everyone's grandma, but she also was disciplined and just gave you love.
Mrs. Bottom. She was an awesome teacher. Very sweet lady.
My favorite teacher would have been Mrs. Barrows. I don't even remember what grade it was, but I remember her still to this day.
My favorite teacher was Mrs. Dye's Spanish in high school.
Mr. Geis, Mr. Erbacher, Mr. Nicelli. There's just so many of them. Mr. Ames, Miss Tibbetts. There's just so many to remember, and all the good things that they did, because they all really wanted to help you then. They only wanted to see you succeed. Even if you didn't want it, even if you didn't see you succeed, it was their goal to watch you succeed. So
my favorite teacher was Mrs. Yates.
So gave this a lot of thought. Lots of great teachers, including Mr. Hanna, who's standing right over there. But my favorite is a couple, actually. They were married, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. One taught me 5th grade, the other one taught me math. And they just were great teachers. They were effective, and they cared about us, and they also kept control of the class. So those were my favorite teachers.
Oh, my favorite teacher was 1st grade Mrs. Pembroke.
In 4th grade, Mrs. Hernandez was. And then through the high school, Mr. Joe Delansky was a very, very fond friend of mine.
Mrs. Skoma.
Mr. Enzina.
My favorite teacher was Mrs. Hagenbach. She was my 1st grade teacher in Alcott Elementary. She was beautiful and kind.
Mike Travers was my favorite teacher at Newfane High School. I became a history teacher in some reasons because he was very inspiring. I loved his style, and I did the same, and then moved to Barker and became a history teacher there.
Favorite teacher, I'm going to just say, there's so many good teachers, I'm going to just say Mr. D'Amato. He was one of my favorites.
Miss Haminga. She taught 1st grade at Newfane Elementary.
Agnes Clark. She was actually our class's teacher of the year as well. She taught me bookkeeping, typewriter, all business subjects.
My favorite teacher was maybe Mrs. Putnam. She taught me how to read in 1st grade, but I had a lot of other favorite teachers. We had Mr. Kopak, my mechanical drawing teacher. I had Mr. Haley, my chemistry teacher. I had Mrs. Kears, my 3rd grade teacher. I had Mr. Landschaft, who was my gym teacher and basketball coach. Denny Sight. So I had lots of great teachers at Newfane. I was pretty lucky.
My favorite teacher was Miss Bergani. She was my social studies teacher in 7th grade. I really liked her. She was young. She was a lot of nice ideas. She was fun.
probably Mr. Ames.
Dick Geis was great. We loved him for chorus and music, and I also had a really good relationship with Roger Marcioni, high school English.
My favorite teacher back in middle school was Mr. Burns, of course. Social studies class was always a great time. He made it light, he kept it straight and straight on the arrow and everything. High school, favorite teacher was Mr. Kirsten. He talked about the Coast Guard all the time, taught you how to do job lots and working out in the field and everything. Great teacher, cross-country coach. Even though I played soccer, the Cupcake Kids, they were okay.
Mr. Wappen, he was a history teacher at Newfane School.
Mr. Pixley.
Mr. D'Amato for middle school math.
I had a teacher in 11th grade. Her name was Mrs. Mann. And that year, for English, she taught English. I don't remember the teacher's name, but he passed very early on in the year. So that's when she started at Newfane. I don't know if she's still there, but she was great. She was one of the only teachers that ever gave me words of encouragement. And I think that that's something that a lot of teachers should do. especially for our youth. But yeah, she was great. Mrs. Mann, 11th grade English. I think I still have one of the papers she graded for me all the way however many years ago. Still floating around somewhere.
Favorite teacher? Probably Miss Sippel.
My favorite teacher was Mrs. Seifert. She was a math teacher.
My 9th grade math teacher, Mr. Barrett, really helped me out.
His nickname was Moose, so Moose, I guess. Mr. Ehrbacher, yep.
Favorite teacher is probably got to be Mr. Tebow. Big inspiration for me growing up. Basically, like modeled my life after what he does now.
I would say Mrs. Tabor. She was my 2nd grade teacher for the L. Middle school, Mrs. Schneider, who is now Mrs. Maynard. And high school, I'm going to go with Mr. Nachuk or Mrs. Lanahan.
Miss Gazzetti, shorthand.
Mr. Kittleson, he taught math at Newfane High School.
Salisbury. It was an elementary school. She was my favorite. She was so sweet.
Probably Miss Kagutek.
My favorite teacher was Mr. D'Amato in the 8th grade for math.
Mrs. Stegler.
My favorite teacher is probably Mr. Tebow. I always loved his class. Even though I wasn't a good artist, I always tried my best, and we would always talk about fishing.
Miss Drankan.
What'd she teach?
2nd grade, I believe I had her for.
Well, of course, Mr. Sellers was my favorite teacher. I had him every year, 9th to 12th, so.
I had two. I had Mr. Villela, Jake Villela, who also was a track coach back then, and everybody liked Jake. And then Mr. Weir, an accounting guy. A lot of people had questions about him, but I always got along. He could have a bite to some of the freshmen in the class, but I always enjoyed Mr. Weir.
Mrs. Tompkins.
Anna Ruth Taylor, my 6th grade teacher. She was fantastic.
My favorite teacher, hands down, was definitely Mr. Hart. He'd always let you come in during study hall whenever you needed to. He'd help you with band music. He'd help you with homework. You could sit there, talk to him. You could sit there, play an instrument with him. During band, he was always upbeat, except for the kids that were always like screwing off, doing whatever in band. And yeah, he's definitely my favorite teacher.
So I remember having Mrs. Bradley in 5th grade and Mrs. Robinson in 6th grade. That was the year Kennedy was shot, and the whole school shut down to listen to the live feed from the radio. And then when you talk about, there was high school, they didn't have middle school when I was back in the day. So we had 3 separate elementary schools in different parts of the district. And so when I went to 7th grade, I distinctly remember Mr. Pixley was my homeroom teacher. And that's when I met 2/3 of the people that went to the school system I had never met, because I always went down here to the small school in Alcott.